Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about who I think are the top 10 one-time players of Survivor US. Now, I did previously do a top 10 non-winning one-time player ranking, and this will essentially be that list, but mixing in the winning players, obviously. So through that, the non-winning players that do end up making the list here, I won't be talking about them in too big of detail because I already did that. This video here will be more so about including these winners onto the list. This honorable mentions I'm going to be talking about here is essentially just going to be every winner that didn't make the list. So let's just start off. I didn't put Bob on the cast, and Bob is Bob. I think the fact that he won Gabon is an anomaly on its own. I don't think that's very repeatable. I don't think he really has a good sense of the strategy of the game anyway. So for me, he didn't really make it on the list. Didn't put Fabio on the list, and kind of for a similar thing. I mean, I do think Fabio is more likely to win any given season than Bob is. But I also think Fabio, again, just doesn't understand the actual strategic game of Survivor. I think he's someone that's very good socially and physically, but I think that lack of strategic knowledge of the game is something that does harm him in my eyes. I didn't put Natalie White on the cast as Natalie White. Again, kind of similar thing. I think obviously she wins due to a quote-unquote bitter jury. I don't really fully agree with that statement because I do think there are people that genuinely voted for Natalie instead of against Russell, but either way, I mean, she was still reliant on other people doing things more so than things that she was actually doing. She didn't really move the game forward. She was mostly in the background while other players moved the game forward, and those players made mistakes that allowed Natalie to win. So again, I feel like Natalie is very reliant on other people's actions more so than the actions of herself. So because of that, I didn't put her on my list either. I didn't put on Chris Underwood, as Chris Underwood, I mean, obviously, as we saw in his original season, got voted out third and eventually came back. And I do think he played very well when he came back. I mean, I don't love that he needed idol at the final five, but I mean, outside of that, I think he played extremely well. He knew what moves he needed to make. He was able to convince Lauren to waste the idol on him. At the final four, he gives away immunity to take on Rick Devens, wins that challenge. I think he really proves to the jury as to why he deserved to win that game. But again, coming into any given season without the edge of extinction there, I don't know how well he really does. Obviously, he did blow up his game at the very beginning of the game, and that's not great. But I also feel like just on any standard season, he's the type of guy that gets targeted at the merge and is the type of guy that gets taken out for being a big physical threat. He's essentially the modern day Burton. And I don't think Burton is a bad player of Survivor, and I don't think Chris Underwood is a bad player of Survivor, but he doesn't quite make the top 10 list for me. Now is one that I think many people probably would have expected to make the list. And to be honest, I expected this person to make the list. And I was actually really disappointed that they didn't make the list. But the more I just thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt like putting them on the list, and that is Vesepia. And I think Vesepia is a very good Survivor player. I am not denying that fact. But the more and more I thought about it, the more I really think Carolyn is a better Survivor player than Vesepia. I think Vesepia has a massive flaw in the fact that she's not able to own her game. I feel like she, as we saw with Marquesas, that's what really pissed people off at Final Tribal there, was the fact that she wasn't able to own what she did in the game. By the way that I hear her talk about the game now, I don't really feel like she's someone that would adapt extremely well to the modern game of Survivor. And I think Vesepia is another one that, like, her win is largely dependent on Nalia sucking so bad that it allowed Vesepia to win that Final Tribal Council. Because I think Vesepia performed particularly poorly at that Final Tribal Council. It's just that Nalia performed even worse. And those votes from John Carroll, Tammy, and General, they were really up for grabs there. So while I do think Vesepia is a very flexible player, I think she's someone that is able to maneuver, I don't feel like she's able to actually execute on things by herself. As you see with the final 9 vote flip against the Road to 4, Vesepia was probably the one that was the least integral to that move. We see Kathy and Sean be the one to come up with that plan and then pull in Nalia. Vesepia really has almost nothing to do with that. Again, that's another thing of like other people's actions being more important to how she wins the game than her actual actions. Again, I just feel like Vesepia has a lot more flaws in her game than some of the players that we'll be talking about later, and some of the other players that didn't even make the top 10 in Carolyn. So for me, Vesepia didn't make the list. And in doing so, I might as well mention this. Surprisingly, no women made the top 10. I really wanted to get Vesepia in there, kind of to get a woman onto the list, but it just didn't feel genuine that would be the case based on the list I had from last time, and then also adding in the winners. There was no room there. And again, I've said this before, how a large factor in that is because a lot of the women that would make a top player of all time list have played again. So for a one-time player list here, it is very tough to get some women very high on the list. And again, here they just didn't make the cut. And the last winner I'll be talking about that is an honorable mention. He was literally number 11 on my list, and I think this might be controversial that he was above Vesepia for me, but that is Mike Holloway. And Mike Holloway is someone that I actually have a lot of confidence in winning a game of Survivor. And the reason for that is, again, we saw what happened on Worlds Apart where he blew up his game at the final 9, but he was still able to win out and use an idol to get to the very end of the game. And that was like a worst case scenario for a player like Mike. But somehow he was still able to pull out the win. And I feel like while that win is not a very dominant win, it's not a win that I would rank highly on a winner ranking, I think it's very impressive that he was still able to do that. Because like if we look at the types of challenges that he won, they were all very different types of challenges. Obviously there is a massive flaw in the fact that I think a lot of the strength to weight ratio sort of challenges aren't really in his favor, as we saw with that challenge that he lost the final 7 against Carolyn. But again, at that point, he had an idol. So I think given into any sort of season, I think he has a good chance of winning a lot of challenges, finding idols. He's a very strategically savvy player. I think he always knows what his optimal move is. So I have a lot of faith in Mike Holloway as a player overall, but he did still barely miss out on the cut here. He landed at number 11. But now we're on to the actual top 10 list. Here at number 10 is the person that ranked number 5 on my previous list, and that is Rafe Judkins. And I mentioned the flaws of Rafe's game. Rafe is a very emotional player. Like, he played a very dominant game on his season, but I think a lot of those decisions that he made on that season were due to emotion. I think he votes out Jamie due to just not being able to stand Jamie in the game. He votes out Cindy in the game because he didn't like how she acted when she won a car. He keeps Danny around because he has a very strong relationship with Danny and is under the misconception that his winning chances are higher if Danny gets towards the end of the game, as Danny beats him if he gets to the end. So if he gets to the end against Danny, he loses the game, while keeping Lydia around, who's someone that's almost guaranteed to lose the final immunity challenge, is a much better situation for him, as really Rafe's only winning scenario in this endgame is him against Stephanie. But again, I think he is a very good social player. I think he was good in challenges. I think overall he is a very good player of Survivor as a whole. But again, those flaws were the things that knocked him down to where he is right now at number 10. At number 9, we have another player that was on my previous list. He was number 4 on my previous list, and that is Mike White. Again, I think Mike White is a very underestimated player in Survivor. I mean, again, his biggest flaw is that initial few rounds. I think he could become a target right off the bat due to his sort of archetype of like the David Wrights of the world, the Stephen Fishbacks of the world, just always coming off schemy very early on. But I think Mike White is a masterful social player. I think he's very good at social manipulation, as we saw towards that end game, where, as we've heard from a lot of the players that were on that season, a lot of people were doing things just to appease Mike White, and I think that's very impressive. Again, he completely dominated that end game stretch of that season from the Carl boot on. I think he's a great player of Survivor. But again, he has that flaw of the initial few rounds not being great. And also, I think he has the flaw of him not really even trying to win. I think if he wanted to win the game, he could have easily won the game. I just felt like he didn't want to win the game, or wasn't willing to go out of his way to win the game. And that's the main reason why he wasn't higher on my initial list. So for me, he ranks here at number 9. Now at number 8, we're finally to a new player for the list, a winner, a very dominant winner, but one I still have a lot of questions about. And at number 8 here, we have the winner of Survivor Thailand. We have Brian Heidik. And Brian Heidik is such a weird player in the history of Survivor because he is the first dominant winner in Survivor US. He's the first one to completely run the game from beginning to end. He's the first person to actively take a goat to the end in Survivor US. But even through that, he almost loses to his goat. And I think that's something that kind of gets forgotten about, is that it was a 4-3 vote. Where I've mentioned this in previous videos, where there was a certain situation that happened with Ken that wasn't particularly great. That if that had gone out, if Ken had revealed what Brian had said to him earlier on the season, I do feel like Ted possibly flips his vote at Tribal and Brian ends up losing the game. So the fact that his win was very determined on whether or not Ken spills the beans on what they said earlier on the season that Ken was very openly upset about. That's not great when I analyze his game. I think Brian Heidick is the type of player that's going to try a lot of things, and some of those things simply don't stick. I think he has a very bad read on people socially. Like, while he is able to build bonds with like the Helen, the Jan, the Clays of the world, the Teds of the world, I think he has a tough time expanding beyond those initial bonds. As we see with like Sheehan, like he doesn't even know Sheehan's name when he's trying to flip her to his side. I think that's completely asinine. Again, his read on Ken was just abysmal. He doesn't know anything about like the Aaron or Pennies of the world. Again, I think he has a lot of flaws in his game, but with that being said, he was a very strategically dominant player. He dominated his season from beginning to end. He was a very good physical competitor. He won a lot of challenges. Again, he was very good socially with the people he was good socially with. Again, he completely isolates other people, but he was very good with that core group. But then again, he was also so close to that core group that when he betrayed them, that made them even more bitter at him. Though I will say again, like something I will give him credit for is that he does ruin Clay's credibility so much that it wasn't enough for them to not vote for him at the end. To be honest, I just don't know how well he does on multiple returns. I mean, this was really the big debate for me with Brian Heidick. Was just, I don't know how well he does on any given season. And that's why, like, initially in my mind, I'm thinking Vesepia as a better player than Brian Heidick, because I can see Vesepia doing better in more scenarios than Brian, but I feel like Brian demonstrated a lot more skill for the game. That, and also I just couldn't argue that Vesepia was a better player than Carolyn. So that's why Vesepia just simply didn't make the list, while Brian Heidick is on the list. As again, I do feel like I'm pretty confident in saying Brian is a better player than Rafe and Mike White and even Mike Holloway, but it's like I do think he has so many holes in his game that's very tough to put him much higher on the list. Now, number 7, we're back to a player that was on the previous list. He was number 3 on my previous list, and that is Devon Pinto. And again, I've said this before, I think Devon Pinto played a very strong game on HHH, being in the center of almost every major alliance. He's a very flexible player. I think he was someone that was surprisingly strategic throughout the game, someone that knew to defend himself against an idol at the final 5. He was able to build that bond with Chrissy and Ryan after his initial alliance got taken out of Lauren and Ashley. If the game had played out naturally, if that final 4 firemaking wasn't involved, Devon has a very good chance of winning the game, really between him and Ryan for who wins. And like, I don't see how Devon doesn't make the merge on almost every given season. And I think once he gets to the merge, he's not going to be the biggest threat around. And I feel like he's the type of player that's always going to be able to build an alliance by the time that he does eventually get targeted. Which is why I do look at Devon as a pretty great player of Survivor. I have to land him here at number 7. Now at number 6, we have the player that ranked number 2 on my initial list. That is Ian Rosenberger. And again, I've already talked about him, but Ian Rosenberger, I think, played a great game. He was someone that played behind Tom the entire season, but knew when it was the right time to strike. He knew when to blindside Tom. But the problem is that Tom was able to win out, and he never really was given that opportunity to take Tom out. But he is someone that if he gets to the end without Tom there, he easily wins the season. And even if he does get to the end with Tom there, I think it's very close. I mean, I think he certainly gets some votes. I think obviously a major flaw for Ian, though, is obviously his mindset in the game. Obviously, by the time he got to that final 3, I think he was just a complete wreck mentally. And that's obviously what causes him to give up immunity at final 3 to Tom. But if he were to still be into the game, if he hadn't completely zoned out by that point in the game, if he wins that final immunity, he wins that season. Mixing that in with the fact that he's good socially, good strategically, and obviously very good in challenges, he's just a fantastic all-around player. So for me, he still lands here at number 6. Now at number 5, we have the person that was number 1 on my previous list, which essentially means that the top 4 are all winners. But yeah, number 5 here, we have the runner-up from Survivor Ghost Island. We have Dominic Abbott. And again, Dominic for me was very clearly the number 1 non-winning one-time player. Again, he came so close to winning that season, the closest anyone has ever been to winning a season that didn't end up winning that season. And I think he also played a very dominant game before that as well. It's not like he just so happened to show up there. I mean, he played an extremely dominant game. I mean, he had some flaws at the early game, and I think that's always going to be the flaw of Dominic's game, is I think he's always going to have trouble in those first few rounds due to him having a perception of being a big player. But once he gets his feet underneath him, I think he's going to be in a very strong position, being a central figure in whatever alliance he's in. And we saw this like from the merge on. He completely runs that season along with Wendell. Though, I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the show at least that he was the main decision maker. And mixing that into the fact that, again, he can win challenges. He's very good socially. I do think he makes a bit of a misstep at that final 6th round. Again, like the move that he does, fake having an idol, and that causes like Kellen to be really upset from the jury for some reason. And also causes Donathan to be pretty angry with him. I mean, that's not particularly great for jury management, but it is something that allowed him to progress another round. And again, coming into Final Tribal, he had 5 locked votes anyway. He just needed 1 more vote. A single vote, and he wins that season. Which that's something that I think in retrospect he would have been able to do if he had known that was the situation that he was in. Again, I think Dominic is a very good player of Survivor. I think he's the best non-winning one-time player of Survivor, but I mean, in comparison to the 4 winners we'll be talking about in a second here, I do think he's a step below them. So now number 4. At number 4 here again, we're on to the winners here. And this is someone that I really wanted to put higher, and that is Todd Hertzog. And the thing about Todd is I do think Todd, given any random season, I do think he can have some trouble early on. And that's something that we didn't really see on Survivor China. I mean, in Survivor China, he was initially put on a tribe that was very beneficial to him. I mean, he had a lot of allies on that tribe, which again, I think you can credit to his social game. He's very good socially, to where almost everyone on that tribe was within his alliance. I mean, he was never really being targeted in the game until the end game of that season. And he was very good at managing the people that he wasn't close with. I mean, he was very good at managing like Jean Robert and James, despite them not being in his core alliance. I think he has one of the savviest strategic minds that we've seen in the history of Survivor. I think he always knew what his optimal move was and always was able to execute that move. He's the one that orchestrates the Jean Robert blindside. He's the one to first bring up the James blindside. He has an all-time great Final Tribal performance. He completely runs that season from beginning to end. He never really has that much difficulty in executing it either. And we are about to talk about someone at number 3 that had a lot more difficulty within the game than Todd. But I think that's the thing with Todd, is that we haven't really seen him face adversity, which is obviously a great thing when it comes to my winner ranking. That's why Todd ranks pretty high on my winner rankings, because he never had to play from the bottom. But the fact that he hasn't played from the bottom also means that there's a massive part of his game that we're kind of missing. He was always in the majority. He was in the initial majority on his tribe. The swap was very beneficial for him. He was already on the majority there. Coming to the merge, he was also in the majority. He was never put in a position where he wasn't in the majority. And because of that, I think we're just missing a piece about his game that I don't feel super confident about. So because of that, I felt like Todd had the rank here at number 4, but again, I still think he's a fantastic player of Survivor. Now, number 3 is someone that I look at relatively similarly to Todd. It's just I feel like this person probably has more flaws in their game, but we've seen this person recover from his flaws, and that is Chris Daugherty. Again, Chris Daugherty has an abundance of flaws within his game, and that's the reason why when it comes to the winner ranking, like, he's a middle tier winner for me, not a top tier winner, because he does make mistakes within the game. I think largely the main one is allowing the women to get the majority, come into the merge, and not being able to keep the Julie Berry and Twyla's on his side initially in the merge. However, again, I think he recovers from his mistakes extremely well. I mean, like, he was the initial target on his original tribe due to his bad performance in the challenge, but he was able to build such great bonds with that Fat Five alliance that were able to stick together throughout the entire pre-swap section of the game. Come into the merge, even though the rest of his alliance was being taken out one by one, he was still able to maintain really strong bonds with, again, the Twyla and Julies of the world, to the point where by the time we get to the final 7, they didn't want to take him out. He made himself a very good option to work with at the final 7 that allowed Scout and Twyla to pick him up, and then he later adds in Eliza as well, where they completely topple the people that were running the game at that point. I do think he mismanages his relationship with Julie and Eliza while in the game, but again, his final tribal performance is so masterful that he wins them back anyway. He's also able to make a final 2 deal with Twyla that, from what I understand, Twyla would have honored. And if Twyla had won that final immunity, she was planning on taking Chris, which I think is, again, a massive boon to Chris's game. I do think Chris is a great player of Survivor. I mean, someone that, again, faced some of the most adversity out of any winner we've seen in the history of the show and was able to overcome it. The only thing keeping him out of number 1 and 2 for me are the fact that I do think the top 2 players that we'll be talking about had a lot more control within their game and did a lot less wrong with their strategic agency than Chris did. Because again, I think Chris actively messes up his game in the post-swap section of the game and in the early merge section of the game to the point where he has to recover from that. And again, it's impressive that he does recover from that, but he still made the mistake to begin with. While the next two players that we'll be talking about were also in positions where they had to play from the bottom at points, but those positions that they were put in were less so because of the actions of themselves, unlike Chris, where again, he actively made the mistakes. So for me, Chris Daugherty, again, great player survivor, but still lands here number 3. Now we're number 2. The number 2 player on this list is actually the person I thought was going to be number 1. I really thought this person was going to be number 1. I expected this person to be number 1 when I made this list. At number 2 here, we have Earl Cole. Out of the one-time winners of Survivor, he is the number 1 ranked one-time winner on my winner ranking. I thought that would carry over here as well. Mind you, I actually did that winner ranking before the number 1 player even played, but we'll talk about that later. Again, I think Earl played an extremely dominant game on his season. He is a very integral part of the majority alliances. He is always within the majority alliance the entire way through. And again, this is the point that I'm talking about with Chris, is that Earl was in a pretty bad spot coming to the swap. When he came into the swap, he was down in numbers, but somehow him, Yao-Man, and Michelle were able to regroup and create a situation where they were back in the majority. And come into the merge, that group was able to stick together and completely run the game. I mean, Earl never really had much difficulty throughout the entire game, despite him knowing almost nothing about Survivor. He was someone that was a last-second addition to the cast and had never watched the show before. So the fact that he ends up winning the season in as dominant of a position, I think really shows just how natural of a Survivor player he really is. And he's very good strategically and socially. He was a great leader for his alliance. He was a good enough physical player. Obviously, he didn't win challenges, but he's the type of person that isn't going to be the first boot on really just any season. He really played an extremely dominant game where he was able to really build really close bonds with almost everyone in the game. I'm in that end game of him, Cassandra, Dreams, and Yao-Man. Like, no one was ever voting him out there. The fact that he was never even a possibility to be voted out at that Final Four round is completely ridiculous. And the only vote he even receives throughout the entire season is a throwaway vote from Rita in the pre-merge. Earl plays an extremely dominant game of Survivor that I think works on almost any season of Survivor. I think also with just his natural ability at the game, that is why he is as highly ranked as he is. However, the only reason I didn't put him at number 1 is because I just don't know how well he would adapt to the modern game. And comparing that to someone that we've seen play a very similar game to Earl, but in a modern season of Survivor, I just felt like that player had to rank higher than where Earl ranks. Though again, Earl is one of the all-time great players of Survivor, so he still lands here at number 2. Now number 1, and as I said, this is a very recent player of Survivor, a very recent winner of Survivor. I mean, it's obvious, right? I mean, like, there's no one else it could be. It's Tommy. I mean, Tommy Sheehan is my number 1 one-time player of Survivor up to this point. And again, I just think he played an extremely dominant game where he was so good socially. He had bonds with almost everybody on all of his tribes. I mean, I think maybe outside of Elizabeth, I think he had a bond with pretty much everyone that made it far into the season. I mean, even Aaron, that didn't end up voting for him, was someone that he had a pretty good bond with. Physically, again, like, I think he's someone that's guaranteed to make the merge almost every single time just based on his physical strength. But he was also someone that was able to downplay his physical ability within the immunity challenges. He was someone that was throwing challenges to lower his threat level. He also has a very good strategic mind for the game. I mean, again, I think his strategic mind is probably on par with that of Earl's. So for me, that's kind of what put them in a similar position here, where again, I don't think he's like a mastermind of the game. I don't think he's the biggest mastermind we've ever seen in the history of Survivor, but I do think he's very competently strategic, and he does pull off some bigger moves, in my opinion, than Earl does. Again, I think the move at the Final Four, where he convinces Nora to bring him to the end, is incredible. I think it's one of the best moves I've ever seen in the history of Survivor. I mean, I think it's really mind-blowing that he was able to somehow not go to fire at the Final Four, where it was very clear that him and Lauren were the 2 biggest threats in the game, where him and Lauren completely dominated the entire post-merge section of the game. And he was able to maneuver around idols and advantages. He was able to get information about the idols and advantages and use that information to his benefit. He was able to build extremely strong bonds with people that he really shouldn't have had bonds with. I mean, people like Dean, someone that he hadn't even met until the merge. He was able to create such a strong bond with him to where when Tommy was being targeted at the final 8, Dean blew up his own game to go and help Tommy. Now, I do think Tommy was in trouble in the game at more points than Earl was on Fiji. However, again, I think a lot of those didn't have to really do with Tommy's doing. If we look at the points that he was in trouble, a lot of those were just due to very bad circumstances. I mean, at the swap, he ends up in a very bad position after that first tribal council, but a lot of that was due to advantages and twists. Again, he was swapped into a 4-4 tie, but initially he was able to get both Aaron and Missy to flip over to his side, and the only reason they flipped back to their original side was because Elaine was able to get a block of vote advantage, and through that completely ruined his chance of staying within the majority, as again, obviously his side would have lost the number. The other point where he was in trouble was the point where they split the tribes into 2, and he got swapped into a very bad situation where it was him against 4 people that weren't in his alliance, and somehow he survives that vote. I think he's able to have such a strong bond with Elaine to where Elaine wants to save him over Missy. And through Missy managing Karishma poorly, I feel like Tommy is able to ring Karishma in as well, and through that they're able to blindside Missy. And again, I think that is an incredible move that he's able to survive that round when he should have been voted out there. Again, at that final 8 where again he could have possibly been targeted, it was 1, Lauren was the original target, and he only gets targeted due to Lauren winning immunity, and even then his relationship with Dean is what saves him there. So again, like, while he was put in bad spots throughout the game, it was largely due to circumstances that were outside of his control, and even through those situations he was able to recover from them spectacularly. So again, unlike Chris, where I feel like Chris actively put himself in bad positions, Tommy didn't actively put himself in those bad positions but was still able to recover from them. And I do think we see more flexibility in his game than we saw from Earl. So again, while I do think Earl is a fantastic player, again, I think Tommy and Earl are like very, very close, but I think for me, I do solidly feel like Tommy is the number one-time player of Survivor up to this point. So there we go. Those are my top 10 one-time players in the history of Survivor US. And this really feels like the end of the journey here. Again, I've been doing so many of these top 10 players of Survivor US videos recently, and to be honest, at this point, I don't really have one planned in the immediate future, but I'm sure I'll be doing more sometime down the road. Obviously going to continue to do more Survivor videos, so that won't stop. But for now, that's my ranking of the top 10 one-time players of Survivor. Thank you for watching.